What happens when a single needle, meant to save a child's life, instead shatters the very foundation of a family? That night, it wasn't blood that broke them apart. It was truth, cold, clinical, undeniable. Martin was a man of structure, both in profession and in life. At 40, the architect had built more than just homes. He had built a world around stability, brick by brick, plan by plan. His wife, Sarah, 38, had been part of that blueprint for the last 15 years. And Noah, their 8-year-old son, was the heart of that structure. His laughter echoed through the corridors Martin designed. His drawings cluttered the fridge doors like art galleries of innocence. But on that storm-racked evening, as lightning fractured the sky and sirens sliced through the wet silence, Martin's carefully built world began to tremble. A car, a screech, a call from a neighbor. Then the rush to the emergency room with Noah unconscious, pale, broken in the backseat of an ambulance. In the fluorescent sterility of the hospital, a different kind of fracture emerged. "He needs blood," the attending physician said, voice taut with urgency. "We'll test both of you, just in case." Martin nodded, barely breathing. He held Sarah's hand tighter than ever, until her fingers went limp. Minutes turned into an hour, then 2. A nurse called Martin aside, her face practiced in neutrality. "Mr. Lewis," she began carefully, "we've run the compatibility panel. You're not a match." He blinked. "That's impossible. I'm O negative. I should match anyone." "That's what we thought too," she said, "so we ran a secondary cross-match. And also did a rapid paternity test. We needed to confirm something." Martin's spine turned to ice. "You're not Noah's biological father." There wasn't anger at first. Just silence. A heavy, slow-forming silence that clamped his ribs and refused to let go. Sarah stood by the vending machine when he returned, oblivious. When their eyes met, she seemed to understand immediately. "You heard?" she asked, her voice barely audible. "Say it," he said, tone flat as concrete. She shook her head, then nodded. Tears welled up, too quickly to be called spontaneous. "It was one night," she whispered. "We were going through a rough patch. I never meant for." "Does he know?" Martin interrupted. "No. God, no. He thinks you're his father. You are his father." Martin walked away before she could finish the sentence. The days that followed blurred into one another. He moved into a hotel, ate when he remembered, slept in short, angry bursts. But each evening, he returned to the hospital, sat by Noah's bed, read aloud from his favorite storybooks. The boy smiled weakly, unaware that something inside his father had unraveled. Martin studied Noah's features now with forensic intensity. Was that nose his? The dimple, the laugh that came too easily? He hated himself for even questioning. But the doubt was like acid. It didn't burn all at once. It corroded slowly. Sarah texted, called, begged, but Martin responded only once. "Is there more you haven't told me?" She replied, "No, it was just the one night. Please believe me." He didn't. One truth had already surfaced. But Martin knew, deep down, in the cold engineering part of his soul, that structures don't collapse from one crack. They fall when hidden fractures finally reach daylight. And so he made a decision, not to forgive. Not yet, but to investigate. Not every betrayal begins in a bedroom. Some begin under bright hospital lights, with a needle meant to save a life, and a result that ends another. Martin stood at the threshold of a truth more disorienting than any betrayal. In the quiet hours of dawn, while Noah was still asleep under a blanket of hospital light and beeping monitors, Martin dropped a small envelope onto a metal desk at the back of the lab. Inside, a strand of his mother's hair, carefully taken from her hairbrush. He hadn't asked for permission. He couldn't bring himself to speak the words, "I need to know if this child is your grandson." The results came back quickly. Clinical, cold, definitive. There was no genetic match between Martin's mother and Noah. For a man who once designed concert halls and museums, cathedrals of order, light, and meaning, Martin now stood inside a cathedral of chaos. Nothing resonated anymore. Every wall echoed with questions. Why had Sarah lied? Why had she told him the child was born from infidelity? Why hadn't she told him the truth? Even if that truth was stranger than the first. Driven by desperation more than clarity, Martin called an old college friend, now a lawyer, to help him access Sarah's fertility records. The path was legal, but barely. Martin never intended to sue. He just needed to understand what Sarah had done and why she'd hidden it from him. The law was just a ladder to the truth. He learned that 9 years ago, Sarah had visited a private fertility clinic known for discretion. IVF, frozen embryos, anonymous donors. But the donor code listed for Noah caught his eye, alphanumeric. But familiar, too familiar, it echoed something in him. Memory, long buried under layers of domestic routine, rose like floodwater. A decade earlier, Martin had donated sperm to a private clinic. He had just turned 30. It was a different time. He and Sarah had broken up temporarily after a miscarriage. She had withdrawn. He had shut down. Donating had seemed abstract, harmless, a gesture of control in a world that had offered him none. He contacted the clinic under a pretense, posing as a man curious to know if any of his biological children had been born. The process required paperwork, validation, and patience, but when the match came back, it carried a quiet thunder. Noah was indeed his biological son. Not a result of an affair, not the child of another man, but his own. He dropped the paper, not out of shock, but grief. It wasn't just the betrayal, it was the exclusion. Sarah had taken from him not only the truth but the experience of choosing. She had decided to become a mother on her own terms. Even if the genetic material came from Martin, she had removed him from the equation. Not physically, but psychologically. She made him a donor, not a father. When Martin confronted Sarah, her face was a blend of defiance and exhaustion. She explained that after their miscarriage, she had lost faith in him, in marriage, in shared futures. She had wanted control, agency, and certainty. When she found his donor file, she made what she called a clean decision, to have a child who carried his genes but not his permission. "I didn't want to ask for something you weren't ready to give," she said. "I wanted Noah to be mine. But I still wanted him to be yours." Martin couldn't respond. There were no words to answer a paradox. How do you reconcile being the father of a child you were never allowed to father? In the days that followed, he watched Noah with a new kind of ache. Every laugh, every question, every innocent glance now bore the weight of complexity. He wasn't a stranger's son. He was his son, but he had been born from silence, not from love spoken aloud. And Martin realized, knowing the truth didn't heal, it deepened the wound. Martin stood at the threshold of his home, the door creaking open not with welcome, but with the weight of history pressing inward. The air was no longer familiar. Each room felt like a theater set, recognizable, yet false. Sarah greeted him with a hopeful tension, her voice low and cautious, like someone trying to coax forgiveness out of a storm. But Martin said nothing about forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, a quiet stillness between them, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the clink of ceramic as she set down his coffee. There were no accusations, no tears, only silence, the kind that carries the density of 1,000 questions. And Sarah, perhaps misreading the silence as permission, began to speak. "I did what I thought was right," she said. "I wanted Noah to have a father like you. I didn't know if you'd ever want to try again after what happened, but I knew you'd be good to him. So I made sure it was you." Martin stared at the steam rising from his untouched coffee. Her words felt like a scalpel, clean, precise, and unapologetic. In her mind, she had done something noble. She had preserved the image of a family while manipulating its foundation. He began to question everything he once understood about fatherhood. Was it biology that made him a father? Or consent? Was love enough to retroactively sanctify deceit? The lines blurred. The man who had once drawn blueprints for skyscrapers now struggled to outline the borders of his own role. Was he a builder of lives or just a donor of cells? Martin began therapy, not to fix the marriage, But to anchor himself, he chronicled his thoughts in a journal he titled, "The Child I Didn't Choose." Page after page, he unraveled knots of resentment, confusion, sorrow, and shame. He wasn't angry at Noah, he couldn't be. But he also couldn't pretend that everything was unbroken. Sarah kept defending her decision with a casual certainty that struck him as dangerous. "If I'd told you, you would have said no, so I did it alone. But it was still your child." It wasn't a confession, it was a manifesto. Eventually, Martin began sleeping in the guest room. Then he stopped sleeping in the house altogether. He loved Noah, but the house had become unlivable, not physically, but philosophically. How could he remain where every truth had been plastered over with beautiful lies? Noah's birthday arrived like a storm dressed in balloons. Martin hosted a party with quiet grace, lighting candles, handing out slices of cake, smiling at photos being taken. But when the guests left and the boy was asleep, Martin sat alone in the kitchen, the last candle still flickering. He whispered, "Happy birthday, son," to no one but himself. The next morning, he filed for divorce. His petition cited emotional manipulation, medical deception, and unilateral parenthood as grounds. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It was the architecture of boundaries. Sarah fought back. In court, she clung to sentiment, memories, milestones, and a child who knew no other father. But Martin had more than sentiment. He had evidence, documentation, the support of psychologists who testified about the emotional erosion he had endured. The therapist spoke of Sarah's control, her justifications, her refusal to acknowledge Martin's autonomy. When the judgment came, it was swift. The court declared Martin both biological and legal father, not just because of the DNA, but because of his enduring presence, his commitment, his choice. And Sarah lost custody. Martin walked out of the courthouse not triumphant, but hollow. He had won nothing except the right to start again. A new home, built this time not on secrets, but on truth, however painful, however incomplete. He took Noah's hand. They stepped out into the sunlight. There were still shadows, but they no longer lived inside the walls. Martin moved through the routines of fatherhood like a man carefully repairing a bridge while crossing it. He packed Noah's lunch, helped with homework, tied shoelaces, and kissed the boy's forehead each night. But something always stood between him, a silence not of neglect, but of containment. Love was present, but not free. It was measured, weighed, and silently negotiated. Each year, on Noah's birthday, Martin followed the same ritual. After the guests left and Noah fell asleep with frosting still on his cheek, Martin would sit alone in the dim kitchen, a single candle flickering on a leftover slice of cake. No audience, no celebration. He'd lean forward and whisper, "Happy birthday," to the gift no one asked for, and I couldn't return. He never told Noah the full truth, not out of fear, but from a conviction that some knowledge was not a birthright, but a burden. He believed that protecting Noah's innocence was the only way to preserve what little dignity the boy's origin story still held. That perhaps love, when given freely, could rewrite the past. Noah, for his part, never pried. He was an observant child, emotionally attuned, sensitive in a way that bordered on intuitive. He seemed to sense the unspoken history woven into his father's tired smile. Yet he never pushed. It was as if he understood that their family, however fractured in its foundation, held together by a quiet resilience. One evening, while cleaning out Noah's backpack, Martin found a school essay titled, "Why I Believe in Good People." In it, Noah wrote, "My dad is the reason I believe kindness is real. Not because he says it, but because he chooses it every day." Martin read those words and wept, not the dramatic weeping of catharsis, but the broken, grateful tears of a man whose heart had been quietly repairing itself without him knowing. In that moment, his grief found a mirror, and in that reflection, he saw not loss, but redemption. Sarah, once the architect of this complicated fate, had vanished. No calls, no letters. Her absence was not a wound anymore. It was simply a fact. Martin never spoke ill of her. When Noah asked, he simply replied, "Everyone has reasons, so do I." He took subtle steps toward formalizing their bond. He changed Noah's surname to his own, signed the papers at City Hall with a steady hand, and framed the certificate. It wasn't just legal, it was symbolic, a name, chosen not by blood, but by love. Their life settled into a quiet rhythm, a house of soft music. Weekend bike rides, and unsaid understandings. They didn't speak of beginnings. They lived in the now. And in that space, they were more than survivors of a betrayal. They were architects of something more honest. In the stillness of a late autumn evening, as father and son watched leaves fall from the porch, Noah leaned his head against Martin's shoulder. "You always stayed," he said. Martin didn't reply. He didn't need to, because sometimes, truth doesn't need to be named. It just needs to be lived. Noah's acceptance letter arrived on a gray morning, tucked between utility bills and grocery coupons. Martin unfolded it slowly, his fingers trembling, not from surprise but from the strange symmetry of it all. Bioethics. Of all the fields Noah could have chosen, he chose the one that dealt with questions Martin himself had drowned in for over a decade. It felt like the universe had a dark sense of humor, sending a boy born from silence into a world where truth and deception were dissected for moral clarity. Martin sat down that evening with his journal, the one he had begun during his first therapy session, titled, "The Child I Didn't Choose." With a pen heavy from years of ink and emotion, he wrote one final line, "You came from manipulation, but you were raised through choice." There was nothing else to say. The pages were full. The burden had shifted. It was no longer Martin's truth to carry. It belonged to Noah now. A week later, a letter arrived with Sarah's handwriting. The envelope was pale blue, unassuming, like the calm before a storm. Martin didn't open it right away. He knew it wasn't for him. It was for a version of him that no longer existed. She wanted to meet, to explain, to say goodbye properly, but Martin did not respond. Instead, he unlocked the fireproof safe where years of secrets slept. He took out the IVF documents, the donor forms, the appointment logs, and the DNA results. He sealed them in a new envelope, along with a letter addressed to Noah. "When you're old enough to understand, you deserve to know, not because it will change who you are, but because it may change what you choose to carry." On the day of Noah's graduation, Martin sat in the third row, his heart pounding louder than any applause. Noah stood at the podium, tall, confident, with a quiet fire in his eyes. "My father," he began, "is the only person in my life who never left, even though he never chose to begin." Martin bit his lip, blinking rapidly. He turned his face away so no one would see the tears. That night, as the sky held its breath over a city of glowing street lamps, Martin burned the IVF file, not out of denial, not to erase the past, but to ensure it would never be used to harm, manipulate, or define. He watched the pages curl and blacken, then turned to Noah, who was setting out 2 plates and lighting candles on a modest birthday cake. They sat together in silence, eating chocolate frosting and laughing over nothing. For the first time in years, Martin didn't whisper a solitary wish. He had nothing left to wish for. Later, as the cake disappeared and the candles melted into stubs, Noah asked, "Dad, was I born out of love?" Martin paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because the truth was finally simple. "Not back then," he said softly, "but now, absolutely." In the quiet afterward, something unspoken settled in the space between them. There are truths that don't need to be known to be lived. And there are fathers who were never chosen, but still become the kind that love makes worthy.